a lot of the time, often the theories that we have about inequality come from somewhere else. They don't come from Kohima and Meerut in Delhi. They actually come from a lot of the places in the North Atlantic, in Europe and North America, where a lot of canonical ideas have been placed about inequality. But the South, which is this term that we debate and talk about a lot in IIHS, to be in the global South is the way people say, what does it mean to look at inequality from here? So what our task then today is to reframe the question of inequality and think about it in two ways, to locate it in the urban and then to locate it in the urban in the global South by thinking about Indian cities specifically, right? And then, because in the question I promised that we would tackle some of this inequality, one of the things we'll do is to think about one way, just one way to address inequality as a problem. And that way is to think about what colloquially we call urban social protection, ideas of safety nets. And I'll talk more about this when we come in. Okay? All right, so let's get into it. So I'm going to share my screen and take you guys through these slides in the back. You should keep me hanging out in your top right somewhere in your Zoom controls. So let's make some provocations, right? I'm going to throw some ideas out that also are about asking new questions. And that's one of the things that the UFP is very particular about, that every year when we teach, we change what we teach because we want to keep asking newer questions. So is there something different in thinking about inequality from place? What does it look like from urban India? Right? How do we emplace the concept? 4 provocations: agree, disagree, think with me. The idea is not to be right or wrong. The idea is to be trying to unpack something complex and thinking collectively about what that looks like. Okay, so here's my provocations. The first one, especially these days, is that everyone is talking about the 1%. How much wealth does the 1% have, the top 5% have? The haves and the have-nots, those classic images of big skyscrapers next to low-income informal settlements, right? And thinking that we live at a time where the question of wealth concentration has become a dominant question of our time. This is essential because wealth concentration is especially a dominant concern of our time. But I want to suggest that this form of inequality, which is about wealth, resources, the material things, economic inequality, I'll call it, actually is given disproportionate attention over other forms of inequality, particularly 3 that matter to me: social inequality, spatial inequality, and political inequality. And I think that one of the things that we have to think about is that the reason particularly that makes this an urban fight, because debates in urban development, both micro and macro, center the economic question. And this has been our way to think about cities are engines of growth. Cities are places where opportunity is created. Cities are places that drive national and transnational economies, right? Particularly in this moment, the urban is a space of multiple forms of particular concentrations of the economy. The urban always concentrates people, building, money, flows, climate risk, right? The urban concentrates both opportunity, it concentrates risk. But in many ways, and certainly the contemporary political economy of the world is a place where economic inequality is possibly higher than it's ever been. But at the same time, when you think about urban India, I want to suggest that we be careful about this disproportionate focus on the economic. And that's my first provocation. The second question then is to say, well, if it's not a disproportionate focus on the economic, then what should it be? I want to argue and present you an idea that in India and in urban India, the social underlies economic and spatial inequality more than we acknowledge. That what seems like differences in class or economic or material or money terms is actually structurally inseparable from distinctions around 3 major social axes: caste, gender, and religion. Which means that what often seem like economic differences are actually social differences. And these are deeply intertwined, right? They're stuck into each other in some ways, but they explain each other in many ways. And one of the things then to think about is to say, what would it be different if we entered urban inequality through social inequality, centering caste and gender, for example, rather than finance and capital and labor alone? How would we then read the city differently? What would it mean to have a segmentation of income analysis and distinguish between upper income, middle income, and the poor, but do it by social categories instead of just by economic categories. And a lot of my contention and a lot of work in the area, but the provocation I want to give you today is that when we look at that same iconic image of the high income, high rise building next to the low income workers, informal settlement, that difference that is clearly spatial, clearly material, clearly in the built environment, that looks deeply economic, is actually a social difference, that those are social geographies, that the building and the informal settlement are not just geographies of how much people can afford, but actually who they are and who they are allowed to be and who they are not allowed to be. Right? And one of the classic ways in which this comes together in a way that makes intuitive sense to all of us is the rental housing market. Often the rental housing market in our cities is not about only about what you can afford. It's actually about who will let you have that house. And that structure of the market is determined as much by identity-based discrimination as it is about market demand and supply and affordability. Right? So the move that we're making, the second provocation I want to give you is that when you think about urban India, particularly, we have to take sedimented, powerful structures of what we call social stratification. You'll see in this, I'll keep moving between concepts from different disciplines, and that's one of the core parts of interdisciplinarity for us. But think of the cities that you know that we live in. Think of our cities as you hear me speak, right? The economic inequality is so obvious. The social inequality takes a layer of unpeeling. It's not immediately announcing itself. And particularly in the urban, because the urban was the hope of where social inequality, particularly based on caste, gender, and religion, diminish. Right? The urban is cosmopolitan. The urban is democratic. The urban is modern. All of these paradigms we have in our head that urbanization leaves behind. If I told you that the village was segmented by caste, you would not be surprised. But if I tell you that the urban is equally segmented by caste, you're like, nay, it's not the same way, right? There's an almost instinctive resistance because we also see evidence of change in mobility, and I'm not denying that. But I'm saying to you that cities are able to, our cities particularly, are able to hold both mobility, progress, opportunity, freedom. There's no denying this, but also continuing inequality, discrimination, segmentation. Our cities are always both. And the degree to which they are both is the challenge of our inequality. Right? And when our inequality persists in some way, then we cannot underplay the way in which cities continue to give way to older social hierarchies that we think in some ways are not the story of 21st century India, but they are the story of 21st century India. And we've got to begin to grapple with these truths. And this is going to get equally difficult when we add, and this is the one thing about our pedagogy always, is we're always adding these layers, right? Because in the city, all things happen at once. You don't get to be an anthropologist and only look at culture thinking the economists and the money have left your field, right? They're always happening layered at once. Let me give you another example of why I think spatial inequality, in a way, links with social and economic inequality. When you think about climate change happening in our cities, where does it happen? So think of the socializing and spatializing of something like climate risk. We know that when floods happen within cities, the areas that are most at risk are low-lying areas, areas that are already in environmentally risky areas, areas near marshlands, areas on hillsides, and typically, who lives in those areas? It is exactly the geography of the low-income urban settlements that matches that. Why? Because when you come to the city and you cannot afford to enter the housing market legally, because again, spatial and economic inequality, then you're forced to build housing because of the failure of the market. You're forced to build housing in the informal settlement. Where will that settlement be? Where land is vacant. Where will land be vacant? Where no one wants it. Why would no one want land in one of our cities, given real estate? It's because that land has something risk attuned to it, right? It's on a slope, it floods, it's low-lying, it's next to a waste landfill, it's next to a high-tension power line, it's next to a polluting industry, it's in the periphery of the city. So precisely the risks of climate change and renewed extreme urban climate events will fall on the risks of people whose income prevents them from more secure housing. So the geography of spatial and economic inequality is the geography of climate risk. See how these two come together. It's this layering that I want you to think about, right? And the third layer, don't forget, which is who are the people that are migrants to our cities that are building informal settlements? They are not unmarked by caste, gender, and religion. So then a geography of social inequality meets a geography of spatial inequality that then attributes climate risk. It's this layering. None of this comes out if we only think about inequality and ask, how much does the top 1% have? So that is a critical question to ask, okay? So see the way this layering is working. Let me give you a third provocation. The third provocation is that in our cities, inequality is not just about the gap between the top 1% and the bottom 50%. It's also a question of the quality of life for the bottom 50%, right? So if inequality is like this, and you have a problem with this, which you should, there is a difference also between where this level is, right? This is also inequality, this is also inequality. But in this one, the baseline for the bottom 50% is much lower. And that's where inequality gets distinct from poverty. So when you think of BPL, poverty line, minimum incomes, for the long time in India, we used to measure the poverty line in kilocalories, 2,400 kilocalories per day, literally in terms of hunger. We have come a long way since then. But the question of poverty has not left our store. And India's economic changes can often make us feel that questions of poverty are older questions. They're not. So in the South, one of the big questions here is we are seeing new kinds of economic ascendancy. The economy is growing, capital is coming. A lot of people have more assets than they used to before. Many people still don't. But poverty remains a large, persistent problem. So inequality with a large number of poor people is different from inequality with a smaller number of poor people. And this is one of the big distinctions, say, between New York and Delhi. New York also has inequality between the 1% and everybody else. But the bottom 50% have a structure of access to basic material capabilities that many people in Delhi don't, right? So the distinction of inequality with persistent poverty, and there are folks at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at the University of Johannesburg, for example, who've been writing and theorizing inequality from the South. And one of the questions they ask is exactly this: what's different about inequality from the South? And they say our inequality comes with equally large numbers of people who are poor. In fact, one definition that we use often in class of what is this global South, one of the definition comes from South African scholars Edgar Peterser and Abdul Malik Simon. And they say the global South are cities where the majority hold vulnerability. Think about this again with me really slowly. The majority hold vulnerability. Now think about that very common statistic we use, right? Half of Bombay lives in slums. A majority of people have inadequate housing. A majority of people in India have access to the right to food because they're considered too close to hunger to not cover them. 6 of every 10, 7 of every 10, 8 of every 10. And COVID was one of the places where this majority vulnerability was on full display. People we never thought was so poor or so vulnerable turned out to be queuing up for ration, to be out of food within 3 weeks of the lockdown. What did COVID show us? COVID showed us that the roots of our vulnerability are still very deep. And even people who may be above the poverty line are just above it and are vulnerable to following below it, right? So inequality in a place where the bottom 50% are still near poverty and hunger is very different from inequality where there is a baseline access to basic dignity, roti kapda makan we used to call it, for the majority, and some people have more than others. A lot of people sometimes say, what's wrong in some people being richer than others? Well, there's a distinction when that inequality comes with persistent poverty, right? And my argument is actually that it does, that in Indian cities today, vulnerability and majority are very much still the story of our cities, not just growth and optimism and dynamism, even though that is also true. So we must theorize our poverty in two ways. Should the 1% have access to that much capital that they do? And what should the bottom 50% have regardless of what the 1% have? And third, what's the connection between how much the 1% have and how much the bot 50% have? And that's the structural part of thinking about this. So to pull all of this together, let me suggest one thing. Then our inequality at this point in urban India is both about the unequal distribution of economic power, which is the economic inequality story, but it's also about the unequal distribution of capabilities, which is the broader social, spatial, infrastructural inequality story. Money cannot explain our inequality alone, neither how it is produced nor how people survive it. Right? And so to tackle it, so the first thing I want to do to leave you with is to give you this sense that one must first think about the way we frame the question before we get into a space of practice or solutions. It is very appealing to throw yourself in to fix something. But half the fight is in knowing the nature of the problem you're trying to solve, to spend time thinking about the question. And I hope I've made you rethink that a little bit. But at the same time, the other challenge of our pedagogy, and we have these debates in faculty meetings at IIHS all the time, is that that doesn't mean you don't think about what to do. It is not enough, as my mother used to say, to do what she called paralysis by analysis, right? It is not only our job to critique. It is not, especially something like inequality, right? You can't diagnose that the world is a messed up place and then say, well, great, I'm done. I'm not going to do anything about it, right? So how do we think about practice? And how do we keep what we here are calling an analytical, very academic sounding conceptual framing? How do we translate? And think of that word translate. It's not only across languages. How do we translate that into thinking about what to do, right? So one thing that we do a lot of work on at IIHS in our area is on urban social protection, right? The idea of the safety net. And you know what social protection is, even if you've never heard this particular term. It is the question of the public distribution shop and the ration shop. It is Ayushman Bharat, the universal health insurance scheme. It is the debates on basic income. It is the question of health, education, housing, safety nets, right? The idea that a shock should not drop you out and you should have some resistance to vulnerability. One of the big stories in India, for example, has been the work of someone like Anirudh Krishna, whose wonderful book, One Illness Away, had this idea that for 80% of people who were above the poverty line 1 year and fell below it, the reason they fell was one illness to one adult member in 1 year. One illness, one adult member, 1 year. Think of how vulnerable then, and go back to that idea of inequality as persistent poverty and significant vulnerability, right? So safety nets mean that no illness should sink a family, right? Safety nets mean that you should be able to think of roti kapda makan as so obvious that you don't worry about them. You're busy getting mobility, flourishing, growth, aspiration, dreams, but you can't do all of that if the floor under your feet is actually mush, right? So how do we build better safety nets so that our inequality can be lifted from below, not just redistributed from above? Two kinds of things again about, now same three provocations from me. You'll notice a lot of provocations, a lot of questions, best use of a midweek masterclass. And I'll take 5 more minutes and I'll stop. So think about and start putting some questions in here. You can also ask me simply to talk more about one of these points. So don't think the question has to be formed and brilliant and wonderful. It's, it's Wednesday. So jump in and just throw in something you're thinking about wherever you are. Okay. So the first one is to recognize, if you're going to do practice, you have to start by saying what's happening now. The first thing to recognize, and COVID was like a slap in our face on this, right? Our current safety net is a patchwork. It's a net full of holes, and people keep falling through it instead of being protected. One of our biggest problems is that much of our safety net that prevents inequality was not designed for cities. It was designed for rural areas. India has largely, for a long time, was thought of as a country that lived in its villages. That has changed, but not really. If you think it's changed, just take a ride on an Indian Railways train and someone will ask you where you're from and then just give an answer that's a city, Delhi, Hyderabad. I guarantee you the next question will be like, no, but that's not where you're from, right? If you're in the south, they'll say, what is your native? If you're in the north, they will say, where were you born? Where were your parents born? Where were your grandparents born? because we are the first generation of Indians who are actually economic development policy happens, but welfare happens in the rural, right? Welfare happens. So we had NREGA, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, 100 days of guaranteed work, one of the largest public works programs in the world for a decade. And only now some states have an urban version of NREGA. We've had the National Rural Health Mission 10 years before the National Urban Health Mission. We had electrification and subsidies in rural areas far before we had them in cities. So one of our histories of why our urban social protections, and go back to place, this is why urban inequality is distinct in India from rural inequality. Rural inequality has its own challenges and their connections are deep, but there is something specific about urban histories. One of them being that we have not designed safety nets until the last 5 to 7 years that were meant for cities, right? Cities were for capital and growth. The rural was welfare, which is, by the way, a disservice to both areas. The second is that even though this gap is closing, we have still never spent enough on our safety nets. It took us until the 1990s to enact the right to education, and then finally GDP spending on education went to 4%. Spending on health is still 1.1%. We have some of the lowest rates of social sector spending of any country of our comparable economic size. Right? And that is a pivotal thing to say. It's getting better. We are doing more. We've been doing more since the early 2000s, particularly when the rights to education, information, and food were expanded in the early 2000s. But it is very important to say that we are nowhere still near enough. We are not near enough for our vulnerability to be reducing. And unfortunately, we keep measuring only our poverty lines. So even if our poverty is reducing, and it is, and it should, and we should be happy about that, our vulnerabilities are not. And I think that still links to what I'm calling insufficient public action. The second is that our notion of social protection is still very, very basic. It's very roti kapda aur makan, right? Baseline food, baseline insurance. We are not thinking imaginatively of social protection as something that not only protects you, but actually can be like a trampoline, a springboard, a push to think about. So scholars call this transformative social protection. Take right to education as an example. Literacy is the base level of social protection, universal. Everyone should have it. It's protective. That's the word on my screen, right? You get up to class 5, it's a little better. It's preventive, gives you more. You finish school, it's promotive because it can help you actually do better than your parents. If you get free university, public university education, it's actually transformative. So even the safety net has different levels. Social protection is different. I think of these 4 words. I'm borrowing this from theorists of social protection, Devereux and Sabatis Wheeler. Protective, preventive, promotive, transformative, right? Things we were just discussing with our current batch of fellows in class a couple of weeks ago. And when I think about that, I think about the urban and go back to the question of urban inequality. And I think, what is it that the urban particularly needs that should be part of an urban social protection that may be even more important than what it is in rural, right? When the migrant workers started walking on highways during our COVID lockdowns, and all of us said, why in the world would you do this? Why would you walk hundreds of kilometers, risking disease, risking death, risking police action, violating the lockdown? Why would you do this? And when they were interviewed on the road, 41% in the SWAN reports, the Stranded Worker Action Network reports, excellent resources for you guys to take a look at. When they were asked, why are you leaving cities? 41% answered rent, not COVID, not health, not hunger, rent. Every state in India, to their credit, was desperately trying to do free ration, food delivery, vaccination. Everyone was trying in a deeply complex. My intention here is not to point finger. But I want to again say, people were leaving not for hunger, but for rent as a major cause, and loss of employment is a major cause. And I want us to think then about trying to solve a problem of rent with the answer of hunger and free ration, right? This is what I mean about thinking about, are we solving the right problem? Are we asking the right question? And so when you think about rent as part, your first reaction is, but it's not roti or kapda or makan. PDS, I understand. Health insurance, I understand. These are basic protections. But rent, this is where new thinking about protection has to come. If we're thinking about urban inequality, two things: rent, transport, access to higher education, these type of elements that are not typically thought of as the baseline minimum. But why should we only be thinking about the minimum? Why should social protection not be the way in which a generation does not inherit the vulnerability of its parents, but actually moves forward? Why should our notion of social protection not be a trampoline where you jump and you go higher, not a net that just catches you and then sends you nowhere? So how do we think about pushing our social protection, not just about poverty and BPL and minimums, but to what Amartya Sen called flourishing? Okay. So I've used the word capabilities a couple of times. That obviously comes from him. But the lesser word that people take from Amartya Sen's work is that he didn't want just basic capabilities to be met. He wanted people to flourish. And think of that word, flourishing, transformative. These are not words we think of when we think of roti, kapda, and makan. And that's partly the problem. We have begun to give to the bottom 50% of our population, think of our first slide, basic minimums instead of structural abilities and resources, things that can actually allow them to move out of that on their own. Right? So think about this second provocation, that there are particular elements that A, should be transformative and not baselines, and that in the urban, these take particular forms, right? And this form of thinking about rent, Chandrasekhar, S. Chandrasekhar at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, once did an analysis that India's poverty line, urban poverty line, would increase by 40% if you just factored in transport and rent, right? So think now of Delhi and Karnataka giving free bus fares to women, and think of that differently from the way you've been thinking about it yet, perhaps. And think of it as an investment in a certain kind of flourishing, a certain transformative social protection, a certain economic development strategy. Don't think of it as subsidy or welfare or revdi culture. These words, subsidy, charity, welfare, they have diminished the political and economic importance of social protection. They have turned them into acts of charity. They are not. They are acts of citizenship, and they are acts of economic development. Our economic development is not just about big capital. It has to be about people. That's what those words mean. Okay, two more and then we'll stop. The third is that in our cities, having rights to something and actually getting them is not the same, right? So in many cases, and I'll give you two examples, when again in COVID, the government said, we will give 5,000 rupees to construction workers, domestic workers, street vendors, transport workers. They managed to give it to construction workers because construction workers under the Building and Other Construction Workers Act were registered. How do you find domestic workers to give from the state if they are unregistered informal workers? How do you find access to low-income informal settlements if they're not mapped or recognized or protected in law or master plans? This is what we think of as economic and spatial informality. And in many ways, 7 of every 10 workers in India work without written legal contracts. Half of our urban residents live in residences which are not fully legal in connection to laws and plans, right? And in many ways, these conditions mean that even when they have rights, the process of applying for that PDS card as a migrant worker whose address is somewhere else, whose Aadhaar card is from Jharkhand, but they happen to be in Delhi, this process itself, the lack of visibility, the uncertainty of residence, are peculiar urban conditions to our cities. That means even the rights people have, they're not able to take, right? And migration is only the starkest example of that, but not the only one. And the last one is to go back to that idea of social protection not being about charity or subsidies. Social protection has to be seen as an entitlement of workers and an entitlement of citizens. And therefore, it becomes very important that this idea of thinking of social protection through beneficiaries who are grateful needs to change into thinking about social protection as a system of claims. And the reason this is important, again, is to take you back to my previous argument. The who of social inequality is as important as the what of economic inequality and the where of spatial inequality. Okay? A lot happening in these slides. But one of the things that I wanted you guys to think about, right, and I'll pause here and then stop, is exactly this idea that one of our ways of thinking about what we call interdisciplinary urban education is this kind of work. Layer and layer and layer. Ask the social with the economic, with the spatial. Do not separate either into discipline or profession sector, because the city doesn't care what discipline you were trained in. The city doesn't care about which kind of ministry you represent. Problems overlap in complex ways. And one of our first ways of unthinking and finding new ways to work is to be able to change the way we ask questions and give ourselves the kind of vocabulary that you just saw to ask these questions. And I hope I've given you one example of the way to do it in thinking about inequality from place, putting it in Indian cities, and then thinking about the multiple ways it translates into practice if you think about actual social protection regimes. So thanks very much for joining me, and take care and follow us, and any kinds of inquiries you may have, contact information is on the website, and I hope you come for some of the other webinars this week. And otherwise, wherever you are, have a very good rest of your evening. And we'll close the webinar now.